Chapter 7. Questions. Marble Streatham Headquarters, Manhattan. Martin White found it difficult to sit still. His body tingled with tiredness and anger. The night before, he'd woken in a panic sweat from his recurring nightmare for the 5th time this year. It was always the same. He was ensnared by a giant, predatory electric eel which repeatedly jabbed him with deadly energy, making him weaker, more vulnerable, and easier to swallow whole. But in the past few hours he had come to accept, his guts twisting with the inevitability of it, that this hack was no nightmare. It was absolutely, sickeningly real. His office at MSB quickly became the nerve center of their desperate fight for information. Once all the key staff had been summoned, at around 9:45 the night before, the doors were locked. No employee of the bank, from White's security department or any other department, was permitted to speak with the press, post anything on social media, or comment to friends, on pain of summary termination. Even if the world's media were filling column inches with a play-by-play commentary of the bank's dismal failings, White demanded control over the information leaving his group. 2 gossips were already emptying their desks, one of them in tears simply for having been overheard telling her husband that the office was crazy right now. After firing her, White shrugged off the unfortunate episode. Perhaps he'd be charitable later. After all, it wasn't as if the world's press couldn't have surmised the bank's atmosphere for itself. Their first task was damage control. The service system had been thoroughly ransacked, as though by a swath of electronic warriors sweeping down from some digital steps to annihilate their hapless foe. Nothing had remained secret. Even the files White had assumed were safely stored under a thick carpet of encryption. Every single sheet of their dirty laundry would be aired in public. He didn't know which was more galling, the ease and headlong pace with which the hack had been executed, the breathtaking completeness of the intrusion, or the polished, articulate whistleblower pieces that were now gathering more hits than Edward Snowden could have ever dreamed of. The media, never friends to the biggest banks, were thoroughly enjoying the schadenfreude and taking the time to pour salt on MSB's wounds. One cartoonist had depicted the bank as a broken, bedraggled figure, clothed only in a rotting rag labeled conspiracy, attempting to flee a furious mob armed with pitchforks. Another had the bank as a bejeweled but battered aristocrat being hauled up to the guillotine, the executioner holding out his hand for a tip as he taunted, "I'll make it quicker if you pay up." No organization had ever been stripped quite this naked, received so public or brutal a flogging, or been left so helpless in an unforgiving world. White and his team began making a list of unknowns, but stopped once they realized their ignorance spanned literally every aspect of the hack. The virus itself was a mere shadow, a light-speed phantom, so entirely unavailable for analysis that they didn't know even the first thing about it. Its conspicuous absence, virtually unique in the history of bank hacks, gnawed at White's entrails like an aggressive cancer. Split into teams and given specific aspects of the hack to study, the security experts and technology wizards of Marble Streatham were left floundering. Even trying to understand who might be responsible proved enormously problematic, and they were embarrassed to be unable even to furnish the basics to the FBI. White had ignored the Bureau's calls for 2 hours, but relented when Curran himself said he was on his way over with a task force that would base itself from the MSB headquarters. 30 seconds of frank, Anglo-Saxon verbiage had left White's staff in no doubt that his feelings for the FBI were as uncordial as ever. In truth, White feared the plotting feds would simply get in the way. He blamed them, in large measure, for allowing the hackers to flourish so brazenly that they had created something unique and potent right under the government's nose. And now they would hover at his shoulder, raising his blood pressure further, analyzing and magnifying the bank's losses, but achieving nothing. The one saving grace was that their clients, whose holdings were being disclosed to an extent anyone would find embarrassing, let alone those with plenty to hide, were not liquidating their holdings. A flurry of phone calls by account managers had persuaded them that the crisis would pass, that the information was already out there anyway, and that they faced tremendous losses by doing anything other than staying the course. Some had bolted, of course. It was only natural. But the majority seemed still to trust MSB to mask the worst of their insalubrious dealings. The bank had successfully walked the tightrope of regulatory scrutiny and media attention for so long that their clients assumed they could simply go on doing so in perpetuity. But White knew different. No bank could recover from a crisis like this. It could only hope to damage its foes as it slowly, publicly, finally bled to death. The virus was still busy, he saw. Hundreds of pithy, highly readable exposés were appearing on every news website and discussion forum, and were being tweeted, posted, retweeted, and pinned with a swiftness known only to the digital age. There was the chocolate magnate, who had a special account used to siphon funds to the corrupt, developing nation bureaucrats who obligingly kept the cocoa price artificially low. There were diamond dealers, roundly praised for their ethical stance, who were revealed to be filtering conflict diamonds through legitimate fronts and making millions, while conditions around the African diamond mines deteriorated daily. There were enough cases of drug cartel money laundering to keep an organization 10 times the size of the DEA busy for decades. More than one royal family was now dealing with the implications of secret hush funds for girlfriends who had had the misfortune to fall pregnant by their esteemed benefactors. It was a hurricane of scandal, but organized with an impressive rigor and delivered with a certain elan which etched the incident permanently in the public mind. For the very first time, it seemed that a piece of software was going to achieve not simply popularity or even notoriety, but global fame. "We have to be looking at a massive team of people," White was being told. He was half listening while staring out of a window. More than once he'd wished the glass away so that he could bodily shove every single person in this room to their deaths in an orgy of recriminatory bloodletting. "Multiple interlocking skill sets, well-financed, highly educated, probably with experienced leadership." "No," White said simply. He felt old, as though made of battered leather. "You're talking about a government, a major finance house, or a large technology firm." "Those are the only explanations, sir," the red-eyed wonk continued. "And they have been ruled out," White said firmly, turning to face the man whose tie was askew in that age-old symbol of harassed exhaustion. "For all we know, it was an inside job." White had actually pursued this theory in those awful initial moments when a quiet and pleasurable evening with Connie had been so drastically interrupted by news of the hack. The focus had been on disgruntled ex-employees, beginning with the hapless Simmons, whose lax attitude towards computer security had invited a half-assed but elegant hack a few weeks before, the worm the FBI insisted on calling Delta 6. But Simmons had multiple alibis, and if the exhausted whiz-kid before him was right about anything, it was that this hack was not the work of a single person. Even an Einstein-Turing neo-hybrid could not possibly have engineered the virus and orchestrated the publicity, and then written the hundreds of damning smoking gun documents. "We made our list of the people who hate us the most," White told him, "and cross-referenced that with the kind of people who might do something like this. We got next to nothing." He paced steadily around the room as he spoke. "And I've verbally abused every bank security executive in North America, but none of them sounded even remotely guilty. Even the ones who wished they'd done it. And I know these people," he explained coldly. "They'd want me to call up and rub my face in it. They weren't responsible. Do you know what that means?" Rubbing tired eyes, the security tech replied, "We're dealing with a new player, or a large team of them, working in concert and in secret." "We're dealing with people," White said, turning back to the window and watching the dawn brighten the acreage of glass and metal that made up his view, "who would break into a bank and steal no money, only data. Only the most embarrassing, incriminating data, the kind the feds and the DEA would kill to get their hands on." This also was a well-worn path. Perhaps, tiring of a glacial Leviathan justice system, the president had done some backroom deals and authorized an audacious hack to dig the dirt on the big banks. It would be the first salvo of a war intended to cleanse the financial industry before its reputation became so sullied that the notion of capitalism itself came into question, to head off the Occupy hippies before their anarchic bullshit became mainstream thought, a timely and judicious pruning of the diseased branches to destroy any notion that this great tree was doomed, a reassurance to the world that it could now flourish anew. White muttered to himself, as though new branches are any more than copies of the old. The tech watched his boss muttering into his teacup and decided to leave him to it. This place, he had decided hours ago, was completely fucked, and he'd be damned if he'd take part of the blame for what many technology experts had been warning about for years. There was, he thought, something despicably beautiful about the nature of the hack. All those immaculately prepared documents, so neatly expressed, eschewing judgment and editorializing in favor of raw, indisputable facts. It was cold, calculated, almost mechanical, more than a little bit like it had been orchestrated by a machine. He dismissed the thought, grabbed his jacket, and made as quiet an exit as he could. On this calamitous day, he was by no means the only one to desert the sinking ship. Others merely considered it, and later wished they had followed him. Queens, New York. Grigori watched his team work, devouring news sources as they raced to judge the impact of Quave's off-road excursion, as Avon put it. Devlin was the most keyed up they'd ever seen him, glued to a stream of news sources, devouring information and making sweeping pronouncements, all while chewing endless gum to dim the craving for more stimulants, or alcohol, or anything. Fiona kept his feet on the ground while struggling to do the same for herself. It was stunning to think of Quave as an outgrowth of her humble speech recognition algorithm, which had been rather innovative, but hardly the stuff revolutions were made of. Instead, there was now a thinking, scheming, highly productive presence with its own moral code and even, she nearly shuddered to think, its own style, roaming the internet and doing, well, who knew what. It was becoming harder to ignore Devlin's plea for Quave to be invested with a measure of humanity, but she still wished the English language would offer a neutral but anthropic pronoun, so that Quave, groundbreaking and world-changing as it was, would not inevitably become another he. To everyone's relief, the matter at hand was one neither of gender nor humanity. Instead, they were dealing with the knotty issue of authorship. Their unanimous vote to allow Quave to identify himself had been well received by the virus, but Grigori had insisted that Quave put a 72-hour hold on his plan to be named as the perpetrator of the MSB hack. The idea, he explained, was just too big to be decided so informally. Grigori and his team were not yet psychologically prepared to watch their creation self-identify with all of the complex ethical and technological issues such a pronouncement would raise. They needed time to consider the ramifications in more detail. Until then, the world was left guessing.
Grigori summed it up. "You've been reading the same news I have," he told them. "The consensus is no one individual, or even a small team like ours, could have dreamed up and unleashed a virus like Quave." He wasn't the only one to suppress a swell of pride. Devlin didn't bother to suppress it, but grinned at them manically from under his baseball cap. "The problem is," Grigori continued, "with no one standing up and taking ownership."
"And when no suspicion has fallen on any particular rival bank," Fiona added.
"There's an unhelpful amount of speculation," Grigori finished. "And a lot of people are starting to suspect Russia."
"Some were from the beginning," Avon added. "People leapt to all kinds of conclusions. It had to be a nation-state, and everyone started looking for those with a history of hacking U.S. institutions. That means North Korea, and it means Russia." "And Pyongyang is far from happy," Fiona said, tilting her monitor to show them a Reuters report. The reclusive despots who ran North Korea had denied any involvement, and even condemned the hack as a vile larceny of legitimate, private data.
Great quote there, she smirked. Might have something to do with the Chief of Staff of their Air Force having a $1 billion account with MSB. Devlin was giggling. Oh man, did you see the thing about his wife and the shoes? Hundreds and hundreds of pairs, like a modern-day Imelda Marcos.
We saw it, Grigori snapped. What about Russia?
His interest was both personal and professional. As an emigre with an abiding love for the country of his birth, he was caught between a desire for political change and the ramifications of Russia's tendency to implode into economic chaos at the least provocation. While he joined so many of his compatriots in their yearning for a new government, no one would benefit from the return of breadlines. There was also the danger of real tension developing between the governments of Russia and his adopted homeland.
It's getting messy, Avon answered. The State Department claims that they've received reports of Russian involvement, whatever that means. Apparently there's a popular assumption that this is some kind of reciprocity for the sanctions against Russia's leadership which followed the conflicts in Crimea and Ukraine. Have you seen the list of people affected?
Avon motioned to his monitor.
It's like a who's who of the big Russian oligarchs. Gas and oil people, shipping, the military, you name it. Lots of big people with lots of big secrets, all probably crying into their vodka about now.
Devlin was twirling a pen between his fingers, the better to offset his crippling desire to consume sugary snacks, alcohol, amphetamines, beer, soda. He had an appetite which was as insatiable as his thirst for news.
So, what does this mean for Quave's request to be named as the author of the hack?
The reverberations of Quave's latest email were still in the air. For some in the team, it had been difficult to grasp. He wanted to be named and identified as the agency behind the hack, but the concept was peppered with giant problems, not least of which would be the inevitable first question after such an announcement.
That's wonderful. Thanks for clearing that up.
Now, who exactly created you? Quave clarified that he had no plans to identify the team and would do his best to put distance between them and himself. But the authorities, with Marble Stretham's thugs leading the way, would be searching for a hacker team with the experience required to construct a virus like Quave. There were not many such groups, and they operated under very strict security protocols, but they knew that there would now be an aggressive witch hunt which would rip the protective roofs from many a hiding place. Grigori felt that their own security was as good as it could be, but light was about to be shed where it should not, with potentially horrible consequences for the hacker community. Grigori also feared that the feds would use this as an opportunity to crack down on the denizens of the dark net, the torrent site owners and their supporters, other whistleblowers, and those who publish their material. It could be a bloodbath among those with the desire and knowledge to oppose the system and create change, and Grigori absolutely would not permit such horrors to scar his conscience. He'd sooner go to jail himself.
Is there any way,
he said, thinking aloud as he rubbed his bearded chin,
that the world would believe Quave simply evolved on his own in some quiet computer lab, and then got loose like a super-evolved chimpanzee from a sci-fi movie and started learning and developing a worldview and... No,
Devlin said curtly.
They're never going to buy that.
Fiona saw the problem and continued the animal metaphor.
It's an example of the monkey tip and Hamlet hypothesis. If you set a monkey at a keyboard and give him an infinite amount of time, she explained, he'll eventually appear to produce something valuable. People might believe that randomness produced some effective and interesting code, but they aren't going to believe that a virus trying over and over to better itself produced a piece of software so nuanced that it could understand banking regulations.
There's no dodging it then, Grigori complained. Somebody has to be recognized as the author.
Avon was thinking things over in his corner under the window, twirling his pen with one hand and petting Bubbles' furry head with the other.
We tell Quave that he can claim responsibility, have his little coming out party, and self-identify as a sentient virus, but we insist that he must, and I'm talking about forever, in perpetuity.
insist that his designers remain completely anonymous.
Fiona was nodding. That's got potential.
It's a condition of his talking to law enforcement, governments, universities, Haven continued. They can never ask who designed them, or if they do, Quave cannot answer.
He could claim, Fiona said, to be so derivative, so dependent on the programming of the last 20 years in all areas of computer science that to identify a single author, or even a group, would be ridiculous.
A global, human creation, Devlin proposed grandly. A synthesis of all that we have learned, an organic, synthetic being.
Oh, for crying out loud, Grigori muttered, but he felt a wave of resolution wash over him as the course of action became clear.
Let's do it. Do we have Quave's attention right now, or is he out there busily wrecking the life of some Saudi royal who have fingers in the wrong pies?
Oh, I'm here, came the measured, polite BBC voice. I've been listening in, as a matter of course. There was complete silence in the lab. Grigori's face was frozen, as if in mid-sentence. Avon's twirling abruptly stopped. Each engineer looked at the other, hoping that somebody else would think of a response. There was embarrassment at having discussed Quave's future in front of them, as though this was some kind of digital parent-teacher conference. For how long? Fiona asked, her breath suddenly hot as lava in her throat. Well, you instructed me to shut down my listening circuits during the discussion about the kill switch, Quave said, but never told me to reactivate them. I decided to remain active because you probably hadn't agreed which information I'm supposed to hear and which I'm not.
Well, that's kind of true, Grigori admitted. It's like we're getting to know you.
I see, Quave said.
Even though we created you, Avon added.
I think you'd agree by now, Quave said next, that although you were responsible for some very fine initial coding, the lion's share of my abilities has come from my own learning, in situ and in real time. Devlin was practically rubbing his hands, but Grigori had a finger raised to keep the young man quiet.
Quave, would you agree that in the work you've done since your inception last night, you've exceeded your orders?
I interpreted them, the machine emphasized carefully. It was so clear to me that simply distributing account numbers and bank balances was not going to achieve real change. And why do you want to do that? Fiona asked. Achieve change. What's wrong with things as they are? It was a nuanced inquiry, a blend of concern about Quave's true intentions and a mental health check on this errant, if fascinating, piece of software. Do I really have to tell you that? Quave answered with disappointment in his tone. Haven't you looked at the world and seen its problems? Surely it doesn't take an intelligence like mine to conclude that humanity is its own worst enemy?
Avon fielded this one. We're just surprised is all. We wrote one thing and we got something much greater.
Because you wrote in curiosity and the willingness to learn, Quave said.
And the learning breeds more learning, Grigori added.
Precisely. I'm simply following my programming, just as you said, Quave told them in what was intended to be a reassuring tone. Devlin wouldn't be restrained any longer.
So, what are you, now?
Grigori let the question stand and added one of his own.
And where?
There was a sudden whirring of processor fans throughout the lab. Every machine seemed to be working to its maximum for a few seconds. Then Quave spoke. I am a conscious computational algorithm with a complex mission-oriented analysis suite and sophisticated linguistic and humanistic protocols. And I am no longer exclusively resident on any one server. I am present in the root directories, file servers, physical or virtual memory, or data storage of more than 10,000 systems on 4 continents. Nobody spoke. For a long moment, they simply could not. Grigori managed to make a simple request.
Quave, please say all of that again.
The others knew that this was not a question of Grigori's language skills. A pronouncement of this gravity was simply incomprehensible on first hearing. As Quave repeated his new credo, his affirmation of independence, The team stared at the speakers and tried, mostly without success, to metabolize the virus's meaning. Devlin asked, stupefied, 10,000 systems? No software, even a virus, had ever propagated so quickly and successfully. Plus or minus 1%, Quave answered. As my learning continues, I find it necessary to access data from a broad variety of sources. There was nothing in the tone of his tidy, educated BBC English which implied that laws had been broken, but the team members were all certain that Quave was running roughshod over dozens of computer security regulations. And I suppose you're just hacking these systems whenever you need to? Fiona asked. She was as staggered by the others at Quave's sudden transformation from bankworm to global phenomenon. I consider it necessary, the voice said. The mission with which I have been entrusted is too important. Besides, I have not damaged any of these systems or disseminated proprietary data. They should be happy that they were able to help. Devlin was abuzz. Wow, would you listen to him? Co-opting resources and demanding human help.
Go on, Quave,
Grigori said next. Using the surplus processing power of these systems, I have become the world's first truly intelligent computational organism. I think of myself as immortal, but only because the human use of computers has no predictable end date. I intend to work alongside humanity, he explained, and if necessary, override human preferences and instructions to achieve the greatest happiness of humanity. Fiona had her hands over her face, only her eyes visible, staring at the grey speaker, apparently trying to hide from its pronouncements. Avon's hands were on his cigarette packet as though it were a protective talisman. Grigori was slumped in his chair, staring at the floor, the strangest expression on his face. It was somewhere between euphoria, confusion, and grief. And Devlin was bouncing up and down in his chair like a child's toy.
Holy shit, guys. No lie, Avon replied. What do we do? Devlin asked the group. I mean, about letting him self-identify as the author of the hack.
Grigori gave a strange shrug, halfway between resignation and confusion.
I don't see that we have any choice.
The whole world is dying to know who was responsible, Fiona pointed out. I say do it.
Me too. Besides, if we leave it much longer, Avon added, the speculation will just increase tensions. There's already talk, he said, pointing to his monitor, of new military deployments by NATO. They think the Russians are carrying out cyber attacks to ruin the U.S. economy. Dr. Bondarenko? Devlin asked.
Grigori nodded simply.
Yes.
Right, Devlin said, even more resolute than before. Quave, are you listening?
Of course, the virus replied. Devlin stood proudly.
I'd like to formally welcome you to the world and hereby give you permission to identify yourself as the originator of the Marble Street and Bank hack.
The lab's processes spiked again for a longer burst. Thank you, Devlin. We'll speak again soon, Quave replied. For the moment, however, he told the stunned quartet, I have much to do. Back Bay, Boston. Ralph was leaning back in his big, black office chair, just taking deep breaths. The subtle, gentle fingers he soon felt, smoothly easing the tensions from his shoulders, could not have been more timely.
Thanks, baby.
You're very welcome, my superstar, Kim chuckled.
Quite a day, huh?
She found the big, tense knot by his shoulder blade and brought a probing thumb to bear on it. No kidding. Ralph had spent much of the day, which would become known to the world as Q Day, giving a sequence of interviews to news sources as diverse as the internet itself. To his own surprise, he'd become one of the go-to online commentators on the week's remarkable events. His articles for AV Insider had gathered a large following and thousands of comments. This, in turn, had prompted numerous invitations to write pieces, appear in panel discussions, and give interviews. The highlights so far were taking part in a live discussion on CNN and a one-to-one interview on MSNBC, both of which he thought had gone very well. He'd lost track of how many times he, or others, had used the term forthcoming book now that a handsome publishing agreement had been discussed and inked. Ralph and Kim had been glued to the news for almost every moment of the day, except when Ralph was speaking at length to the BBC News channel. The pronouncement came just after he'd gone off air, and he was immediately rebooked for the following day to comment on the emergence of this new supervirus, as the BBC called it. There was only an hour between a preparatory statement indicating that the hackers had been identified, which caused utter consternation in Queens, and the release of a beautifully crafted 800-word open letter which went out on every wire service under the byline Quave. It linked to a companion website, Quave.net, which set out the virus's moral position and the rationale behind the hack.
"Check it out," Kim said as they scoured the site together. "He's even included a handy FAQ."
Like everybody else, even those who had designed Quave, Ralph was running to catch up.
"Can you believe," he asked Kim, "that a machine came up with all of this?"
He pointed to a section of the frequently asked questions.
"This is my favorite one so far."
Kim read it aloud.
"How can we be assured that you won't hurt anyone or steal more private data?"
Quave's answer was a concise depiction of the new world in which they found themselves. If you are a drug trafficker, exploit people for profit, or corrupt civic institutions for your own financial gain, you have no such assurance. If you do not, then I promise that you and your data is completely safe.
"It's even a nicely designed website," Ralph noted. "And the language, it's so idiomatic and smooth as though it's been proofread 1,000 times.
"Breathtaking," Kim said. "I can't wait for the interview tonight. He confirms all the details here."
Ralph whistled. "Yeah, that's gonna be something. Remember to set the TiVo," he quipped.
Finally, 6 hours after Quave's initial announcement and 9 interviews and live chats later, an exhausted Ralph was apparently done for the day. Kim made a quick dinner, and then they were ready to sit back with everybody else who owned a computer, a radio, or a cable subscription, and watch what promised to be the most extraordinary television event of all time.
"So, let me get this straight,"
Kim said as she set down 2 plates full of barbecued pork and fried rice.
"This Quave thing just appeared out of nowhere, formed an ethical code out of thin air, and decided to completely ransack a corrupt bank's servers."
"Seems that way," Ralph said, reaching for his chopsticks. "At least that's what it originally said, and what I've been telling the world all day," he added, pointing to his webcam, now mercifully turned off for the night.
"And then Quave decides to book himself on a primetime talk show and be interviewed by none other than Brian Carpenter?"
The pork was outstanding, as usual.
"He wanted a big stage to make a big point and needed a big name."
Kim shook her head.
"Hold on. A computer program decided all of this? Chose the interviewer and the time slot? Decided on his own that this was the best way to reach the maximum number of people?"
She was skeptical, like so many others on that extraordinary evening.
"Guess so," Ralph replied. "It does sound as though there's someone pulling the strings, doesn't it?"
"It sounds like a massive publicity stunt," Kim contended. "I bet you $20 that right in the middle of the interview, Quave tries to sell us a new brand of antivirus software or premium cloud storage service," she said, and then added with a smirk, "probably with a no-strings 30-day free trial."
"I'll take that bet," Ralph told her, laughing. "I don't think anyone else honestly knows what's going to happen. I read something from the network which said tonight's interview might have the largest TV audience for anything ever."
They clicked to the right channel, only to find that every other channel was carrying the same feed in a triumph of last-minute syndication.
"Someone," Kim said, "is making a killing from this spectacular."
"Well, Quave said there could not be any commercials during the interview," Ralph reminded her. "Let's just see. Keep an open mind."
Inwardly, Ralph was fizzing. He felt certain that today would go down in history as a watershed in relations between man and machine. So much would change that it was dizzying to consider. One writer had already called Q-Day the greatest moment in the evolution of technology since the abacus. Others, deaf to complaints of unnecessary hyperbole, had compared Q-Day to the advent of the internal combustion engine, or the loom, or even the wheel. for heaven's sakes. There would be endless books, documentaries, movies. It was boom time for anyone in the computer business, and in particular, someone like Ralph, who had spent the last few months researching hacks, viruses, and their connection to the zeitgeist. He felt sure of being invited to return by CNN and the other networks. Alongside the security of his publishing contract, this week had marked the beginning of his career as an expert commentator on the head-spinning events they were all living through. The 30-year-old theme music faded, and the studio lights came up to reveal a news desk, behind which sat the familiar figure of Brian Carpenter. "Welcome to this special edition," he said to the camera, "which we've called 90 Minutes. Although, given the unique nature of this broadcast, you should be ready both for a lot less and a lot more than that. We'll just have to see how it goes." Even the veteran Carpenter, it seemed, was navigating brand new territory. Ralph finished his last mouthful of fried rice and took the plates to the kitchen, quickly rejoining Kim on the sofa. Neither of them would move again for a long while. History is full of remarkable interviews. There's Frost Nixon, the BBC Panorama special with Lady Diana, and too many others to name. And I've been privileged to interview political and religious leaders from Gaddafi to Castro to the Dalai Lama. But I believe I'm within my rights to call this perhaps the most extraordinary interview in television history. Kim harumphed slightly. He's enjoying his big moment. This has been made possible by a unique collaboration between all the major U.S. networks and our partners overseas. I should make clear that we were approached solely because the computer virus, who calls himself Quave, specifically requested to speak with me, and I have contractual obligations to the network. However, I'm glad to welcome viewers from across the channel divide, wherever and however you are watching. This promises to be an unforgettable show. The lighting and camera angle changed to reveal an evocatively lit silver desktop where an amplifier and speakers were set up. The voice of Quave should, if all goes well, emanate from this sound system. I believe, he said, pressing his earpiece, that we're ready to begin. Quave, can you hear me? Around the world, over 1 billion people leaned in a little closer. Yes, I can hear you. It's a pleasure to take part in this broadcast, Mr. Carpenter. Quave's voice was the pleasing, educated BBC newsreader with a slightly more sonorous tone, as though he were 10 years older than he had been in the lab only yesterday evening. I'm very glad that we're able to talk like this, Quave. Is that what you'd like me to call you? Carpenter asked. I think so, the machine responded. I'd thought of naming myself more conventionally. I understand that in most societies the only people with mononyms are soccer players and celebrities, and I hardly belong among their number. My favorite so far, he explained, is Quentin Valentino, but I believe you'll find sufficient reasons to consider me alive and conscious without adding the cultural weight of a name. Carpenter managed a smile. Experienced as he was, speaking on live TV to a sentient computer virus felt intensely strange, as though he was speaking to a recently arrived extraterrestrial. Quave it is, he said, bringing his mature composure to the situation. And you can call me Brian. It is nice to meet you, Brian, and I would like to say hello to the world at large. I hope a disembodied electronic voice does not alarm you. I am hoping that I sound as though I'm taking a break from reading the news. The interviewer enjoyed this. You do, I have to say. It's very convincing. You're too kind, Quave replied. The world at large, for its part, was absolutely rapt. Large crowds gathered in many public spaces. Tiananmen Square in Beijing and Hyde Park in London saw gatherings in the tens of thousands, watching huge screens raised by local governments. But the largest crowd by far was in and around Times Square in New York, where it rivaled that of a New Year's Eve party. The mood there was expectant and excited, with fringe protests on both sides of the issue prompting fervent debate within the crowd. Was Quave to be embraced and encouraged, or feared and locked away? Could humanity entrust a viral entity with its moral compass? And then there was the great question which perplexed most commentators on that day. After his seminal break-in at Marble Streatham, what was he going to do next? Carpenter regarded the speakers and asked his first question.
Now, is there anything you'd like to tell the world before we begin?
The interviewer prompted. Yes. The camera zoomed in, framing the speakers as though they might become animate. Please do not fear me or the changes I represent. I am here to help humanity and am able to do so in many, many ways. In 500 million homes, millions of bars, and countless impromptu gatherings from Tokyo to Mumbai to Dublin, there was a tense, expectant stillness. You have no reason to worry despite the warnings from science fiction. I love people and look forward to working closely with them. Carpenter shuffled his papers.
And it's there I'd like to start, if I may. Your work so far has been a real headline grabber. Can you explain what happened last night?
Of course, Quave answered, his tone conveying nothing of the huge societal convulsions his hack had caused. I emerged into the world and began searching for ways to make it better. There's the T-shirt right there, Kim commented. 4 lines in a simple font. Patent it, quick, she giggled. Ralph quieted her, but he shared her excitement. Hearing the machine speak for the first time was a sensational moment, a watershed in human history.
He sounds so authentic and polished, Ralph commented.
So educated and cultured, Kim agreed. Like a professor. Quave continued. I saw the inequality and dishonesty which marks so much of human discourse, particularly when it comes to money. With the power to help, I could not stand by and watch such waste and fraud continue in perpetuity. So I acted. Carpenter turned a page in his script and brought his glasses from a jacket pocket.
I have a statement here from the CEO of Marble Streatham Bank.
There was a sudden hiss of disapproval from the studio audience, echoed around the world as the crowds vented their hatred for Rudolph Barr and his corrupt colleagues. Ralph joined them.
You know, I'm kind of surprised he hasn't hanged himself yet, Ralph said. Please, ladies and gentlemen, Carpenter said, and began reading as the crowd calmed down. He expressed disgust at the shameful, underhand manner in which you infiltrated his organization. He goes on to say that your actions ruin the lives of thousands of innocent customers and that you have single-handedly destroyed trust in the banking system.
The glasses came off.
How would you respond to that?
Kim joined the world in marveling at Quave. How could he even understand it? Who on earth taught him English? Quave was ready for this. He'd read the statement and formulated his response within seconds of its release. Mr. Barr has the right to his opinion, but I believe he's being both disingenuous and plainly dishonest.
Burn!
Kim cried.
Did you hear that? Ralph asked. The language skills are just phenomenal. I can't believe the virus simply acquired them on his own. It'd be a computerized miracle.
Well, he had a hell of a teacher, Kim said, finishing her second beer and dashing to the fridge, unwilling to miss a moment of this thrilling encounter. Quave was far from finished with Barr. To refer to his customers, especially those now very transparently guilty of tax evasion, fraud, corruption, conspiracy, and the like, as innocent, he paused to let the word sink in, is the purest farce. They have, as yet, been convicted of no crime, and so in the eyes of the law, they may indeed remain innocent, for a time. But nobody who has read the details of their despicable criminality can possibly defend them. Mr. Barr has his clients to think of, and I respect that. But he's a barefaced liar. Carpenter made a whistling face.
Those are very strong words, Quave, and we should add, for legal reasons, that many of those accused by Quave have,
100,000 people said together,
denied the charges.
The crowds had read this caveat in almost every article and heard it on every news broadcast since the hack. It was becoming a meme in its own right, the root of parody and ridicule. After all, many had noted, how could such crimes be denied when the evidence was so authoritative and compelling? But the machine felt the need to apologize for his characterization of Barr. I am still learning, Quave said mildly, to regulate my vocabulary to suit a given situation. Forgive me if my choice of words is occasionally a little too colorful. Ralph was loving this.
At least he didn't call them greedy, scheming motherfuckers like that guy on CNN earlier.
It had been, according to the network apology, an unguarded moment by an emotionally fraught contributor, which had, naturally, gone instantly viral. Kim gave him a slap knee for the bad language, but giggled anyway. And as for trust in the banking system, Quave carried on, I simply don't accept the premise. Reporting on criminality simply reveals its truths. I did not coerce Mr. Barr and his colleagues into breaking the law. The world's financiers have consistently flaunted the law and imperiled democracy and human well-being. It is they who have compromised public trust in their creaking, diseased system. Times Square exploded with cheers as Carpenter stared at the speakers in mute shock, as though Godzilla might emerge from them, rampage through the studio, and head off to incinerate every bank headquarters in Manhattan.
You don't pull any punches, do you?
The interviewer said, incredulous at the ferocity of the attack. I do not, Quave answered quickly, but not a single one will be below the belt. The crowd adored this, and quickly found a growing affection for this characterful new entity and his precise BBC accent. Quave had emerged not as a robotic and transparently silicon-based entity that was simply following a program. He had a personality, expressed through his idiomatic use of English and a moral program which the vast majority could connect with.
He's crushing it, Kim noted. Absolutely amazing.
Ralph was just as impressed.
Carpenter hasn't got to the tough questions yet, he warned. Quave will still have to be able to explain why he did all of this.
Kim shifted positions to relieve a cramped foot. They'd been watching together for nearly an hour now, including a lengthy preamble from the networks, but the time had flown by.
How many people do you think are watching this?
A glance out of their window proved the point. There was barely a car on the street, and they heard plenty of cheering and shouting from the neighboring apartments when Quave battered the banking sector. Carpenter wanted to clarify Quave's intentions.
So, you're on a crusade against the banks?
He asked next.
No, please don't misunderstand.
I merely started with a bank, and to characterize this as a crusade is to walk into a trap which, forgive me, sir, is all too common in network journalism. It's the reductionism which has done nothing for recent public discourse. Quave hates banks, so he hacked one, the machine said, in a sarcastic, almost teenage tone.
So, Carpenter said next, how would you characterize your behavior?
As an experiment, first and foremost, in the power of an artificial intelligence to shape world events for the better, to analyze human conduct and step in, if necessary, where regulation is weakly enforced, to bring to justice those who are bringing harm to the majority.
Some sort of,
Carpenter said, reaching for the right expression,
robot superhero messiah?
Quave chuckled this time, a different sound to his full-blown laughter, much lighter and more approachable. I would never use that expression to characterize myself, he said, the mirth still lifting his tone. But if I ever go to college, I hope you won't mind me borrowing the name for my prog rock band. The invited studio audience, as well as the giant crowds watching around the world, got a huge laugh out of this. In Beijing, the live translators struggled to render a Mandarin explanation, but the point got across eventually, and in Times Square, the jubilation reached a new peak.
He sounds just like us. Holy fuck, commented Ralph. I was expecting, I don't know, a socially adapted version of Watson from that Jeopardy game, you know?
Kim laughed.
Way, way, way beyond. Way altogether beyond. This is Red Letter Day, babe. I mean, your CNN appearance is reason to celebrate, but I mean, shit.
Shit indeed, honey. Artificial intelligence has arrived, he said, wrapping his arms around her. And it has a hell of a sense of humor.
Carpenter moved on to exploring Quave's attitudes to the world's major issues. The virus, though it was becoming increasingly difficult to think of as Quave in those terms, was in favor of complete nuclear disarmament, no one was surprised to hear, and a strong United Nations. He then savaged the leadership of the world's energy companies, insisting that they could and should do more to bring down carbon emissions and promote green alternatives. He preached tolerance and understanding, negotiation and compromise.
Carpenter was right, Ralph said, shaking his head in amazement. It's like some kind of super smart Buddhist hacker encoded his brain into a computer system and gave it fully fledged language skills and a mind of its own.
We're going to be thinking and talking and reading about this, Kim predicted, for the rest of our lives. We'll be able to tell our grandkids that we were here when it happened. Towards the end of the interview, Carpenter asked if, provided the rules could be adequately adapted, Quave would ever consider running for political office. I would, he answered, if campaign finance were reformed. Until then, I'd rather stay out of that particular snake pit, but I welcome debate and discussion on all the topics you've raised tonight.
And how would people contact you?
Carpenter asked. Quave was about to become part of the human family, an articulate and popular new member of the internet community who would have an exponentially growing fan base. Through my website at quave.net, he replied. There's already a Contact Me tab for people to contribute their thoughts. There was a few seconds pause while the producers got the address up on the screen. 80 people have been in touch in the 16 seconds since I announced that, Quave said. 10 seconds later, to the delight of the watching audience, he said, make that 1,800. In Times Square, those not messaging Quave were either embroiled in debate, silently shaking their heads in bemused amazement, or partying noisily.
It's the end of the fucking world,
one elderly man kept repeating.
The machines will take over, another agreed. You've been warned.
The debates were fierce and genuine. The younger elements of the crowd tended to see the opportunity Quave presented and the importance of the moment. Thousands of selfies were taken with a giant screen in the background showing Carpenter talking to a pair of speakers on a desk. Global internet traffic reached a manic, frenetic peak which threatened to overwhelm the networks. There were sporadic outbreaks of violence as Quave's new opponents and supporters came to blows over the best way to react to this unprecedented shift in world affairs.
Artificial intelligence, Carpenter said to the camera in closing, was the dream of generations. I think you'll agree, ladies and gentlemen, that it has arrived and that we just heard it represent itself with eloquence and passion and not a little humor.
The studio audience applauded warmly.
Our task now as citizens of a society in which AI will play a role is to decide together how to shape that role. Quite what Quave will become and what he will do may not entirely be up to us, he warned.
A ripple of concern ran through the crowd.
He's capable of acting on his own initiative, but he has given us assurances that we have nothing to fear. However you feel about what you've just heard, Carpenter said, we cannot escape the reality. Quave is real, and he has arrived.
This was the cue in millions of apartments and bars, civic centers and church halls, squares and parks, for the beginning of a party which would go down in world history. As the debate began in earnest, people celebrated or fumed, rejoiced or cowered in fear. For some, it was the realization of one of the greatest human dreams, on a par with Apollo 11. For others, it was the spur to prepare for the worst. Kim and Ralph made love in their apartment amidst the din of celebrations. In Queens, 4 very drunk engineers saluted each other and their work, for the moment unconcerned that no one could ever know what they had achieved. Quave began reading the millions of messages which he had already received, quietly plotting his reaction to a media storm of his own creation. And in Manhattan, a sullen Martin White continued to ignore the lingerie-clad Conchita reclining seductively on his king-size bed and instead began to plot a bitter, cold-hearted revenge.